My name is Ryan Pankau. I'm a horticulture educator here for Illinois Extension, and I serve Ford, Iroquois, Champaign, and Vermilion counties here in central Illinois. My background is as a forester and an arborist, but I've had professional experience and personal experience in working with native plants and prairie restoration, and so that's brought me a great interest in this question of natives versus nativars. So which kind of plant should we select for our home gardens, for a restoration setting, for any other type of place that we might put a native plant? So let's start with just a few definitions. So to begin with, what's native mean? Well, I think a lot of us have our own definition, but I think a lot of the definitions are based upon human disturbance in the landscape and when we as humans started to come into play and manipulate plant populations. So for me, I think that's what my definition of a native is. It's really a plant that was endemic here before human disturbance or human interaction started to change things. But time frame applies to this. So if we're talking about, since human settlement of this continent, that might be a time frame. If we're talking on the evolutionary scale or the geologic time scale, that's a hugely different time scale to quantify native. So I think for most of us, what we're talking about is a plant that has not had human influence as to where it grows and proliferates in our native ecosystem. So there's also geographic considerations for this term native. So a good example of that is one of my favorite urban trees, the bald cypress. So bald cypress is barely native to Illinois. It's certainly not native to central Illinois where I'm at, yet it is an awesome shade tree, a great urban tree, something I highly recommend folks plant. I've got a number on my property and I just absolutely love this tree, but it's technically not native to here. So I think for me, again, with this geographic definition of native, that kind of falls to within the borders of Illinois. That's usually kind of my definition. I don't necessarily get so specific that I'm down to the county when I think of native, but I usually try and think of, in terms of the state of Illinois, what is native? So that brings us to the big question of nativar. What does that term mean? I think we've probably all read it. If you're interested at all in native plants, we've read it one place or another over the years. But to start with, a cultivar, or a cultivated variety, is just a plant that was produced through breeding or propagation to achieve desirable traits. So you often hear about cultivars of different landscape plants or ornamental species, and that's all we mean. It's a cultivated variety. It's something that's been bred for those specific genes that we want in the plant. So a nativar is a native plant that we've done that same thing to. We've either selected or hybridized or crossbred this native species to get this nativar, this stable variety of that plant that we can reproduce over time and create more of. So I do like Ricker's definition there of a selected genotype with superior ornamental characteristics and landscape performance when compared to that straight species. So the regular species. You're probably going to hear me say that a lot tonight, the straight species. I like to refer to the regular, just plain old species as straight species. So in science, you hear them talked about not in terms of nativar, but in terms of cultivated natives, native cultivars. It's usually a combination of those terms when we're talking about that. And finally, genotype, that's just the genetic constitution of an individual organism. So when we talk about planting a more southern genotype of a tree species, and that's something that, as we've started to look at how and where we should plant trees with respect to climate change and a warming climate, one of the recommendations is to plant a more southern genotype of that plant. So that's just a set of those genes of, say, a pin oak or whatever species that might be that we were looking at from south of here, that's more adapted to a southern climate, so it has the genes that allow it to grow better in a warmer climate. So that's something we also probably talk about tonight too, is genotype. Nativars, here's yet another definition from Annie White in 2016 from her PhD dissertation, which we'll look at some more information from a little bit later. But I also like her second sentence here, that because cultivars have been selected primarily based on their ornamental traits, it's not clear whether they perform the same ecological roles as the species which evolved naturally in the landscape. So that's an important thing to think about, is that these native species evolved naturally in the landscape with the influence of time and all the factors that they were exposed to. So when we breed for something different, we've altered that native plant. So the landscape industry in the US has traditionally supplied us with non-native plants. And if you look around you in the average landscape setting in the US, 70 to 80% of those plants are non-native. And when you look around at a garden center or a nursery where you might purchase plants, a good majority of those native plants that are available are nativars. So there's some type of cultivar of a native variety. So what's changed that we all of a sudden, now a lot of folks want to plant natives. We're looking for them in gardening centers. We're seeking those out. Well, there's been some changes in views with gardening, looking at it more as a lifestyle. So that translates into a lot of the other things that we understand are important for our lifestyles. There's also been an awakening to ecological needs of the environment. So we've got a greater awareness of this ecological value in urban areas because our human footprint has drastically grown over the years. We've started to see a shrinking population of nature around us and a growing human footprint. And so we've started to value these areas in and around our homes and our landscapes in our cities and all types of developed areas as much more valuable these days. So that's led to this native plant gardening movement. And it's been going on for a couple decades, but the interesting thing to me about this is maybe a rare instance where gardeners have influenced industry. Where in the past, the landscape industry has kind of produced plants for us. I guess we've always had some input into that. And not to blame the landscape industry, because for the past, several, maybe even 100 years, we've wanted a lot of these ornamental non-native plants. So this new movement towards native plants and gardening is something that's been interesting and different. And how we've influenced that is it's caused the landscape industry to try and create native plants that they can propagate, they can produce easily, that do well in cultivation. And that's resulted in the creation of some of these nativars. So it's interesting, we've influenced the gardening industry and they've kind of came back to us with these plants. And now we're stuck with this conundrum of what should I plant, a native or a nativar? So as we've started to become more aware of some of these ecological issues and things, we've also started to realize that we do need biodiversity in our ecosystem. So we need biodiversity all around us for all of these ecosystem services you see listed on this slide. It's a very important thing that's built all these things on this planet that have supported life. So it's important that we preserve it. So when we look at biodiversity and food webs, and you look at how that energy flows through food webs, all of our animals in these food webs get their energy directly from the sun, or by eating something that just ate a plant. So either a herbivore eats a plant that got its energy from the sun, or a carnivore eats one of those herbivores that just ate a plant that just got its energy from the sun. So in essence, that's a really important transition between this energy the sunlight brings into our planet and the animal food webs that that energy supports. So in all of that, insects play an extremely vital role because they're kind of like that bottom rung of the food web. They start it all off. They're oftentimes herbivorous. Insects are oftentimes that first step from plants into the animal kingdom, where the next step, something carnivorous, eats one of those herbivorous insects. So without these insects, our food webs would collapse. And so that's where some of this discussion of the need to plant natives and need to support ecosystems has turned towards is a look at insect life and how we can better support them. So that's what I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about tonight as we look at the question of answering a native versus a nativar, is how do those plants support insects and how do they support this food web that we need to support globally? So in recent decades, we've seen insect populations around the globe declining. Worldwide, about 40% of all insect species are in decline, and the primary drivers are listed here kind of in order of importance that this published study conveyed to us. So habitat conversion is one of the biggest impacts to insect populations, and we've done a lot of that around the globe at this point in time. So followed by pollution and synthetic fertilizers and pesticides in the environment. That's maybe the second biggest impact to insects. Pathogens and introduced species, invasive species, that's maybe the third. And then finally, climate change is an ever-growing factor on insect populations, but probably number 4 on the list as this study saw it. So when we look at some of the other information in the body of research that's out there, we know that insects comprise about 2/3 of the terrestrial species on Earth. And we know that the declines in insect populations are substantially greater than that in plants or birds, and that's in Europe and North America. So insects are getting hit harder than some of these other animals in the food chain. Again, intensification of agriculture, conversion of habitat into production areas has probably driven like this global insect decline over the last 6 decades. And in more recent decades, the widespread use of pesticides, meant to kill insects, has kind of exacerbated this problem or sped it up. So we all have probably heard about the importance of pollinators. They're incredibly important to not only the native plants out in an ecosystem that need this function of pollination, but also to us as humans and higher organisms in that food web. So, 75% of our global food crops rely on animal pollination, and 35% of our food that we produce globally is a result of animal population. So that's where you hear this 1 in every 3 bites you take, a pollinator is responsible for. So pollinators are an important mix in all of this, answering this question of native versus nativar and what's their value. And so it's important to also remember that over time, pollinators and plants have this co-evolutionary history. So they have, on the evolutionary time scale, millions and millions of years, they've coexisted. It was really at about 150 million years ago when flowering plants emerged that insects started to notice those flowers, and that really changed and set that evolutionary path for both insects and plants on a different course, and they've influenced each other over time. And that's also another factor of this, that not just our immediate food webs are at play, but this long-standing evolutionary relationship between plants and pollinators is something that is critical, that we don't disrupt, and that we support instead with our plant communities. So this long evolutionary history has resulted in, today about 300 to 500,000 species of flowering plants that exist on the planet, and 9 out of 10 of those are angiosperms that are supported by pollinators. So, and we also know that today insects are the most species-rich group of animals on Earth. So that means that the greater the impact we're impacting more species as we impact insect pollination populations. So what is it that pollinators look for in a plant? Here's just some of the major factors of what a pollinating insect looks for in plants. And some of the reason why we're talking about this is because these are some of the factors we're going to compare and contrast and talk about when we compare natives to nativars tonight. So this is just kind of a short list of some of those. And so I love the flower of the northern catalpa down in the bottom right-hand corner, and you can just see how those nectar guides, those little lines that lead into the center of the flower there, are just set up to draw in a pollinator. And that's one of those intricate relationships in nature. So what is the research to date on plant and insect use? So we've had a lot of studies published in the past on native versus non-native. So which population of plants better supports insects, natives or non-natives? And there's a whole body of research that's looked at that. And for the most part, most of those studies have found that our native plants support insect life a lot better than our non-native plants. So in recent years, though, studies have started to look at native versus nativar. And so that's what I'd like to review tonight to answer this question of what's better, a native or a nativar. I'd like to look at some of this research that's been published. So this first study that I'd like to look at is a dissertation project by Annie White, who is at the University of Vermont. And it was published in 2016, but the research was done 2012 to 2014 at 2 different study sites in Vermont. So again, not Illinois, a different setting, different native plants. So she looked at 11 different species of native herbaceous plants. So we'll look at woody plants in a couple studies in a minute, but for now, we're just focusing on herbaceous flowering plants. So kind of what I think of as the forbs in a prairie. So that's what you would think of these in Illinois. So I'm going to go through some of these and look at the plants that are native to Illinois out of her study, because there is about half of them that were only native to Vermont and would not have occurred here. So we'll just take a look at in-depth look at what the natives to Illinois. So what Annie did was set up some plots and then went out and directly observed pollinator use on the specific natives versus the nativars and compared those results over time. So insects were just categorized by sight, by actually seeing them. They weren't actually collected, where some other studies would collect, where they could identify down to species. So they were kind of lumped into 7 groups of insects. And here's kind of just the look of her paper. So this is again, just right out of her dissertation as it was written. So for each of these slides, I'd like to compare the native versus the nativar. So the plant's common name is up here, kind of in this glowing common yarrow is the name of this, the common name of this plant. But if you see under the first bullet, the scientific name is listed, and then versus, so it's native versus nativar. So for the nativar name, if you notice, it's not in italics, and strawberry seduction is in little quotation marks, and that's how you can notice, that's how you know it's a cultivar of another species. So in this case, strawberry seduction was compared to the straight species of common yarrow. And for each of these slides, I'll try and kind of in the bottom two bullets kind of summarize, pollinator use and underline the one that was the, had the most pollinator use. So in this case, the straight species had the most pollinator use at about 1,400 pollinator visits over the 2 years of the study, whereas the nativar only had about 119 pollinator visits. So that's a big difference. So what are some of the differences in these plants? Well, the straight species of common yarrow has significantly more flowers per plant. So that really weighs heavily on this number of pollinator use of each plant. If you have more flowers, you're probably going to get a lot more pollinator use. So when breeding was done to produce strawberry seduction, it was actually done to improve upon a past cultivar called summer pastels. And what they were going for in this selection was more red colored flowers and a less aggressive habit. Because if you guys have ever seen common yarrow on the landscape, it's definitely an aggressive plant, it takes over. So sometimes that's one of the things that we breed for, is a more well-behaved nativar. So in this case, the regular straight species was better in the eyes of pollinators and was much more used. And so now let's look at butterfly milkweed, one of my favorite natives. I have a ton of this plant at my house. And so we're going to compare the straight species to this high yellow nativar. And in this case, surprisingly, there was more pollinator visits to the high yellow nativar than there was to the straight species. So I was surprised to see this, but this plant was bred for its yellow flowers, but morphologically, so as far as habit, height, height, width, all the other things about its form were pretty much the same. So all we did was change flower color, and that's upped pollinator use. So one more thing I'll add about these slides is for the native species, I've posted a map of Illinois of the range as posted on IllinoisWildflowers.com in the bottom left corner there. So for each one of these natives, you can kind of see just how abundant it is in the state or how many counties have a record of that plant as a native plant. The next plant was wild bergamot, and we compared Annie White compared the straight species to this Claire Grace nativar. So in this case, again, the native species was a little more popular with the pollinators, 877 to 660. But what were some of the things that were bred for in this cultivar of wild bergamot? Well, increased drought tolerance and some disease resistance were bred into it. You can see from the pictures, the flowers are slightly darker or pinker. But plant height, bloom time, bloom duration, all those things kind of overlap. So she measured all those things, the bloom time of the two different species, all those things kind of overlapped. But the one big difference that was noted in the data that they recorded was that this was actually selected from a genotype from the southern US. And keep in mind, the study was in Vermont. So this nativar was not quite as cold hardy as just the straight species of wild bergamot in Vermont. So it couldn't handle the Vermont climate as well. Survivability after the first winter was not as good for this nativar. So that's another thing that we can kind of lose or gain is some of this cold hardiness depending on where the selection was made for this nativar. Penstemon is the next one that we'll compare, and we're again comparing the straight species to this nativar called Husker Red, and you can see a pretty big difference here in that Husker Red has a little bit of red foliage, definitely red stems, a more upright habit, but a similar flower shape. So the biggest change really is just kind of like the name implies, Husker Red is involving a little bit more red coloration and a pinkish tint to the flowers. You can see that a little bit in the picture there, but overall, pollinators overall had about 229 more visits compared to 147 for the Husker Red. But again, on the native species, we have a greater floral abundance, so more flowers per plant. So flowers per plant was about 1.3 times greater in this case. So that may have contributed to some of the fact that pollinators use these more. Interestingly, though, the non-native honeybees found Husker red less attractive, whereas native bees found the native species more attractive in this case. So the next plant we'll compare is black-eyed Susan in terms of Vermont, but in terms of Illinois and the Midwest, we probably refer to this plant as orange coneflower. So that's Rudbeckia fulgida. So we're comparing this variety of it, that is Goldstrum is the nativar. So in this case, there really was not a statistically significant difference between pollinator use, but by one pollinator, there was a difference where the nativar had one more pollinator visit over the 2 years of the study. But that's not a statistically significant difference. That's not something that Annie or the author of this dissertation showed is actually significantly different. So in this case, what was changed? Well, it's a more compact habit than the regular old black-eyed Susan or orange coneflower that we think of. It's actually a shorter bloom period, but it actually kept the same winter hardiness. So same winter hardiness between both, but a shorter bloom period. So that's kind of interesting that pollinator use was about the same, even though there's less flowers on the plant for the same amount of time. Finally, New England aster, I think, is one of the last ones. Maybe we have one more in this study to review. And so the straight species was compared to this nativar, Alma Pachski, and we had quite a bit more pollinator visits or use in this case, 2,100 compared to just 234 pollinator visits on the nativar. So what's the difference between these plants? Pretty obviously, you can see in the pictures there, the nativar it's a lot pinker of a flower. So a big change in flower color. You know, a little more compact of a habit. It was one of the things that was bred for in this particular nativar. Anybody that's grown New England aster knows that if you don't cut that plant back or pinch off the buds a little bit to make it bushier during the growing season, you're going to have a big plant flopping over that you need to support about this time of year. So that was one of their goals in breeding. So a shorter, more compact habit and a change in flower color has really changed this pollinator use of this plant. Okay, the next one was spiderwort, and there are just tons and tons of spiderworts out there. A ton of different nativars, a ton of hybrids of these. And in this case, this nativar red grape that we're actually looking at is a hybrid from multiple crosses. So we brought in a lot of genetics, even across species lines here. It's not just in one species or a native that we've bred for characteristics from, but really changed a lot in this plant. And, you know, we did actually get more pollinator use for the straight species than we did for the nativar, but through some of this breeding and changes in genetics, the actual native plant had 2.7 times higher floral abundance per plant than the nativars. Whereas the nativar was more compact, it actually had a longer bloom period than the native. And then we also changed flower color. So that was a big change for pollinators is flower color. We've changed it from purple to magenta in this case, added a little bit more of a pink tone to it. So the next native is Culver's root, one of my favorite native plants in Illinois. I love to plant this one in the landscape. And so we compared the straight species, which got not as much use as this nativar. So in this case, we flip-flop backwards, where the nativar actually was more popular with the pollinators. So what was changed in this case? It was bred for you know, you can see there's a change in flower color. So we've changed that from a white flower to kind of this pale purple color. A more compact and predictable habit was bred for out of this. Also an earlier and longer bloom period. So there's times where this longer bloom period is coming into play. So in this case, the nativar was quite a bit more popular, almost twice as popular as the straight species. So it's kind of an interesting result. And, you know, I can attest to the fact that Culver's root could have some improved habit. This is in my own landscaping bed, and it's kind of hard to see, but down here here's the flowers on this second stalk of Culver's root, where, you know, here's the first stalk, nice and straight, and this one got hit by something early in the springtime, a disease, I think, that kind of knocked it back. and creates this irregular habit. So that's one of the things with nativars. The horticulture industry is trying to straighten out some of these problems and not have this plant that kind of flops over and has flowers down to the side. Now, as far as pollinator use in my own garden, I can tell you I've seen just as many on this flower that's lower down as the flower that's up. So anyway, that's just one example. New England aster would be another one. I should have probably put a picture of that one in as something that we can improve upon by breeding and getting a little more stable of a habit. So what are some of the conclusions from this PhD work? Well, overall, insect pollinators prefer the straight species over the nativar. So in 8 out of 11 cases in this study, the native was preferred over the nativar. Hybridized nativars were less attractive, and we looked at one of those that was, there was a couple others that were Vermont natives I didn't cover that had the same case where the native straight species was pretty much preferred by insects. So to me, the bottom line on this is that really, as we've looked at the results of this study, they vary. There's times that, yeah, 8 out of 11 species are better in this case, but that's not strong enough for me to not say that we probably need to, each nativar needs to be evaluated on an individual basis. We can't just, write off the fact that a plant when we change the flower color, we reduce insect preference, because in the case of common yarrow and butterfly weed, they were opposite trends. Common yarrow, the native insects didn't like it as much. And in the case of butterfly weed, where we added this yellow flower, natives liked it more. So to me, it shows, and other studies will show tonight that we look at too a little later, that the native species is probably the best planting strategy. So planting that straight native species is probably the best, unless you're able to dig in and look at the individual case for that nativar and understand that it's better. So the next study I'd like to look at, it was a paper that was published in 2018, and it was Emily Basiden's master's thesis. You might recognize the familiar name of Doug Tallamy's listed on this one, and he's done a lot of work in this area. So she was a student of Doug Tallamy's. The research was done in Delaware, started in 2014, and all the plants were planted. This was done on woody plants, so on 10 common ornamental tree and shrub species that were native to Delaware in this case. So again, we're looking at a study out east. So I've tried to pull some results from this that kind of, again, relate to some of the species we would have here in Illinois, which I think just about all of these, there's maybe only a couple on the list that were not natives to Illinois. So 10 of these species were compared to at least 1 to 4 of their native cultivars. So what they looked at was 6 different ornamental traits that are listed down here. So they looked at changes in leaf color. They looked at adding leaf variegation. So we'll see some pictures of that, but that's when you add kind of that white tone behind the green, or 2 different colors to the leaf. Essentially, you've removed some chlorophyll from the leaf is what happens in that process. They looked at growth habit. So a more desirable growth habit. In most cases, that was a dwarfing growth habit, but we'll see in the case of sweet gum, there was a columnar growth habit, so a skinny and compact and tall growth habit. Disease resistance was something that some of these plants are bred for. Increased fruit size and yield, and then finally, enhanced fall color was another one of the attributes that some of these nativars were developed for. So there was some interesting three different levels of data collection. So with the insects, they collected the feeding insects in the field, June, July, August of 2015 and 2016. And then what they did was collected mature leaves off the plants, took them back to a lab, and that's what you can see in the upper right-hand corner, some of their little lab plates. They cut out this perfectly circular section of each leaf, and then they had this bagworm species feed on that leaf as it hatched. And they measured how much, with that little grid system underneath each Petri dish, they could measure how much of the leaf was fed upon using, actually using an electronic scan. So the insects collected in the field, there was leaf feeding in the lab that was measured, and then there was leaf feeding on just leaves that they collected from out in nature. So they were trying to compare in a lab with this bagworm in this isolated situation, how much leaf feeding was done. If we collect leaves from the field and we analyze the damage on each leaf, how much leaf feeding was done in that way. So here's some of the results. So I'm going to try and list kind of in the glowing text there, the nativar trait that was analyzed here. So this is the change in leaf color from blue to red to purple. So we've took a plant with a green leaf and we've changed it to red, blue, or purple. So in this case, native supported more insect feeding in this case. So the nativars were not preferred. And here's kind of the 3 different nativar species. This eastern red cedar cultivar of Juniperus virginiana, you don't see a change in color here right now in this picture, because it's fall color that's blue. So that's the change. In the arrowwood viburnum, so Viburnum dentatum in the center picture there, it was actually bred to get that kind of 2-tone new growth. So the foliage comes out as kind of red, where the older foliage stays green, and then there's a purple fall color, so really pretty fall color. Where finally with this sumac species, they bred for this new growth to come out as really purple. It kind of fades to green, and then there's enhanced fall color as well in the fall time. So again, I'm going to report these p-values because it shows the statistical significance of the finding here. So if the lower the value, the better in this case, and statistical significance is shown when we have a 0.05 p-value or lower. So if it's above 0.05, that means there was not a statistically significant difference amongst these. So in this case, pretty statistically significant difference where natives were preferred between these species. Okay, so these species were actually bred for disease resistance. So we had an American elm that was bred for Dutch elm disease resistance, was its major reason why that Princeton nativar was developed. Cornus Florida, that's flowering dogwood. So it was bred for anthracnose resistance, and that's a big issue for dogwoods. Across the eastern U.S., anthracnose actually kills a lot of them. And finally, actually the center one should be red twig dogwood. I'm sorry, that's an incorrect scientific name there. So Cornus Florida is on the right here, this Appalachian Spring cultivar, but both of those were bred for anthracnose resistance. So there is a significant difference here where the nativars actually supported more insect feeding in this case. And again, this is from the field collected insects. So these are insects that were actually collected out in the field. Okay, so this next nativar trait that was looked at was variegated leaves. So we had, again, another flowering dogwood with these, here you can really see variegated leaves. So at the left is flowering dogwood, which was bred for, those variegated leaves and kind of a pinkish new growth and pink flowers. In the center is a sweet gum that doesn't have like that just textbook leaf variegation pattern. It's kind of a striped or speckled look, and I've seen this plant have even almost a wavy look to it in places I've seen it grown at arboretums and other places. So interesting leaf variegation, but on a sweet gum species. So that's the liquid ambar species in the center. And then at the right is this a species of red twig dogwood, silver and gold. I think we've all seen this in the landscape. If you looked around at many landscape plants, it's all over the place. But nativars actually supported more insect feeding in this case, in the case of leaf variegation. And in some of the results, one of the hypotheses for why this was the case is, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we do when we breed for leaf variegation is we have less chlorophyll in leaves then. So that's why you see some of the white leaf area there. It also means that there's less nutrition in those leaves. So some of the thinking is that we know insects, when leaves are less nutritious, they eat more to make up those nutrients that they would have lost. So some of the thinking in this case is that there was more insect feeding because these leaves were less nutritious and the insects felt like they needed to eat a little more in this case. This next nativar trait is enhanced fruit production. And so high bush blueberry at the left there, this Chandler variety, which I actually have planted and grown in Southern Illinois, was bred for much larger fruits. It's known for its really good sized blueberries. We have a holly species in the center, deciduous holly or winterberry is what I would learn that plant as. So it was bred for, if you could believe it, more abundant fruits. And finally, we have another arrowwood viburnum, which was bred for larger and blue fruits, where it would normally have a more blackish colored fruit. And in this case, nativars did support more insect feeding. So all 3 of these nativars were preferred by the insects over the native species. And here's just a couple other results that I was going to add that, again, these are not significant. The p-value here is higher than 0.05. This is 0.85 for modified growth habit. I didn't put all the examples in here, but this really columnar habit of the sweet gum at the right is one of the plants that was included in this. And then enhanced fall color, it's no surprise that a red maple was used in this study. There's a lot of red maples that have been bred for just that brilliant red fall color. And in that case, we did not see a significant difference in either one of these from the field collected insects feeding. So now let's take a look at, remember I talked about how they took a little circle of leaf, they put it in a petri dish and they measured bagworm feeding. So that's what they've looked at in this case. So in this case, with the leaf color change from red to purple or blue, the natives supported more insect feeding in this case. So, and pretty significantly in both years of the study. Whereas with leaf variegation, Nativars actually supported more insect feeding in 2015, but not in 2016. So in 2016, it wasn't a significant result. So in this case, I showed both of the Nativars that actually showed the greatest difference amongst their data set. So it was the sumac species in the upper right and the sweet gum in the bottom right. So that was all that was really significant in the feeding preferences in the lab results. So now the last section that I'd like to review of this paper was the actual cumulative leaf damage results. So this is measured from leaves collected out in the field. So those were insects. It was exposed to all insect life out in the field. These leaves were collected and that damage was measured. So again, this change in color, natives supported more insect feeding, meaning that the natives were more desirable to these insects compared to a nativar that had a changed leaf color. For leaf variegation, the nativars, just like we saw in the other trends from other data collected in the field, the nativars actually supported more insect feeding. And so in this case, the nativar trait of, again, leaf color, I think there may be actually an error on this slide, so I'm going to skip to this next one. So the leaf damage results for leaf variegation was kind of inconsistent across the years. So the red osier dogwood, compared to its nativar, was a little more preferred in 2015 and 2016, but across all species, there wasn't really a strong preference identified. Maybe flowering dogwood was the second result that they could report for leaf variegation, where it was almost significant. But again, this p-value of 0.06 was not significant, nor 0.09, but it was close. So this is another variegated variety of dogwood, and actually not the one in the study. It was just one that I happened to get a good picture of. But just wanted to show that there's also yellow variegation in leaves as well as white. So what are some of the conclusions from this study? Probably the biggest one is that, those cultivars selected for a change from leaf color, from green to other colors, really reduce insect herbivory on the nativars. So the native species were preferred. That green leaf color over a purple leaf color or any other color was preferred 3 to 5 times more. And this agrees with earlier.
It just said something mute off.
From other researchers that's been published. So it agrees with some of the other body research that's out there. So some of these other traits that they looked at did cause some changes, but it wasn't in a predictable way. So, there really wasn't like this pattern out of those other 6 traits they studied. There was times where something was significant or not, but it wasn't across all the different ways they measured this data, it wasn't significant. So I put one little note in there that it may actually be good in the case of disease resistance, that it didn't make a difference, because that would lead us to believe that breeding for disease resistance for things like Dutch elm disease, which really has impacted elms heavily, would be a good idea to breed for that. Because we're not going to actually reduce the value to native insects if there's not a difference in feeding preference. So, so if there's maybe a good side to not finding something, that's the case where there is kind of a good side. So I'd like to look at one more study tonight. And so this was published in 2019, it's a little more recently, and it's comparing just 6 native shrub species to their various cultivars. So this was another study that was done out east, conducted in Connecticut, on plots that were planted in 2015, and then data was collected 2 years later, 2017 and 2018. So for these 6 native shrubs, they had 1 or 2 nativars of each that they compared to the native species. So I listed the 6 right here, and there's 4 that are actually natives to Illinois. Chokeberry, wild hydrangea, and ninebark are all native to Illinois species. So we'll talk about those in a little more detail, and we won't actually talk about those natives to out east, although they are kind of in the cumulative results and some statistics. Well, yeah, so with chokeberry, there's actually 2 nativars that were compared. So there's the nativar, this Yukon name 165, which was a little bit shorter than the native species, about half the height. If you look at it, it's about 1 foot to 24 inches. And then finally, this, the bottom nativar that was compared here was way more compact. And that's a picture of it in the bottom right there, where it's only 8 to 14 inches tall. So, so in this case, when they compared, the straight species to both of these nativars, there was more total visits on just regular black chokeberry than there was on either one of these smaller nativars. But one of the things they noted in there was that there was actually many more flowers per plant on the larger black chokeberry that was sometimes up to 6 feet tall. So maybe flower abundance was the determining factor in this case. But fact of the matter is, the native species was more desirable than the non-native. And the next one compared, it was wild hydrangea, and this is an Illinois native, and they compared it to Annabelle, which was actually a variety of our native hydrangea that was developed here in Illinois. It was selected from just wild genetics out in the wild in southern Illinois near the town of Anna is what it was actually named after. And so in this case, there was the native straight wild hydrangea was much more attractive to insects, 3 times more for bumblebees and 2 times more for bees. And if you look at why Annabelle was selected for, what's some of the value in this plant? It's strictly for ornamental value. So if you look at the flower in the upper right, it's not nearly as showy as what's on Annabelle, but you can see some of these infertile flowers around the edge of the flower cap. It's called a lace cap flower. It's kind of that arrangement. Basically on Annabelle, there's a lot more of those infertile flowers. So those are actually bracts that you see as opposed to flower petals, those white things. So Annabelle is just a natural variation that happened where it has a lot bigger and showier flowers, but they have way less pollinator value. And that's because, 42% of the flowers on that plant were found to be infertile in this study, whereas 99% on the native straight hydrangea arborescens was found to be fertile. So in this case, there's an extremely greater value with just the native straight wild hydrangea than this more ornamental species. So finally, the last one that was looked at in this study was ninebark. And so you can see there was quite a bit of change in this development of this Nativar. Diablo, I guess, is kind of the trade name that I've seen it advertised as. I think a lot of us, if you've looked around the landscape, you've probably seen a lot of these purple leaf ninebarks. Some of them are actually crosses with European species. In this case, it was just the native species that was bred to get these characteristics. So a little bit of pink in the flowers and purplish leaves were the biggest thing that was changed in this plant. Bloom period, habit, size, form, abundance of flowers, all those things were kept the same. Whereas, just kind of that color change was happened. So actually syrphid flies preferred the nativar in this case. And they, the folks in this study speculated that it was because those white flowers contrast with the dark leaves and make those flies a lot more attracted to it. So, and we know that syrphid flies are more attracted to like white and yellow flowers as opposed to just a straight white flower. So what were some of the conclusions here that were found? In this study, they found examples of insect preference for both the straight species and nativar, so it really wasn't conclusive. What were the main factors that they found as differences? Well, when you change that flower, like in the case of Annabelle hydrangea, when you convert anthers and pistils, the male and female flower parts to petals, or change that flower, whether it's to a sterile flower, that was a big deal. Changes in flower color way more heavily. And also, you know, changes in size, plant structure, and habit. But but one of the things that they speculated at the end of this study was that, you know, smaller stature plants may attract just as many pollinators on a per plant basis, just due to the fact that they have a good abundance of flowers, but when you compare them to, like in the case of the first plant we looked at, where it was, you know, a chokeberry that was 6 feet tall compared to 1 foot tall, that does make a difference. So, and again, one of the main results of this is, you know, the need to assess plant value on an individual basis, as opposed to just saying, in this case, you know, it's always the nativar that's better. So what are some of the conclusions from all of this that I could draw? You know, there's a number of studies that have found insect preferences for native and for nativar. So either way. So out of all these studies, I think one of the biggest things we can learn is that changes in leaf and flower color and changes in flower form were the most impactful to pollinating insects. So those were the biggest deal. So if you had a choice of a native tree that has purple leaves versus a native tree with green leaves, you're better off with the green leaf. And you know, that some of those changes in color went along the same lines for flowers. So when we change that, insects are really tuned into that color that's given off by plants. And so changes in flower color are a major difference that seems to signify typically a not preferred nativar if we change leaf or flower color. You know, and changes in flower form. So we looked at that with Annabelle hydrangea specifically just in the last couple of slides. So when we really change that flower form around, that is going to have a big impact on insect use. So finally, I mean, I think the biggest conclusion that I've found is that the native straight species is more likely the best bet across the board, but it all depends on the cultivar. So it depends on the situation, depends on the native or the nativar. And you know, the last point here is that definitely more research is needed. There hasn't been a lot of direct comparisons between natives and nativars. Out of all the literature that I could look through, I only found, you know, 6 or 8 studies or whatever were listed on one of those earlier slides. So there's definitely a need for a closer look at this problem. But as far as the conclusion I can reach as a gardener is probably native is a better way to support insect life, if that's one of my objectives. So with that, we'll go to some questions. I did want to point out that if you're interested in planting a garden of native plants or nativars, the Pollinator Pocket Program is one that we have here at Extension that on our website, we have a lot of information with little planting schematics that can help you arrange a nice pollinator garden, a lot of information about pollinators. And so check out our website. If you're interested in planting a pollinator pocket or registering an existing planting, you can send us an application that gives us the info about your pollinator pocket, and we'll send you one of these beautiful and attractive signs that you can hang up and educate all your neighbors about the values of pollinators and native plants. Here's my contact information. If you folks do have questions down the road, feel free to reach out to me. And lastly, I write a weekly blog called The Garden Scoop. You'll find a lot of topics on native plants, on trees, on vegetable gardening, but check out my blog. I post there once a week. And if you like these topics, these are the kind of things that I focus on. So with that, I believe we have some questions gathered that we could answer. So we'll go.
Yeah, we do. We do, Ryan. Thank you. Great presentation. Yeah, you have a few questions in the chat box. And just following up on what you just concluded with, Elizabeth asks, so is Annabelle a nativar or just a sport with no changes in genetics? Are these preferences all for pollination or also for egg laying?
Well, Annabelle is a nativar because it was, you know, just a naturally occurring hydrangea arborescens out of nature that just happened to have more abundance of those sterile flowers that were more ornamental. So it was around the turn of the century or so, the early 1900s, that some ladies in Southern Illinois saw this plant out in nature, brought it back to their home in Anna, and for many years it was just something that was handed out to the local community and hadn't reached very far before. There's actually a plant breeder that was a professor here at University of Illinois that developed that into its variety. So into a, you know, marketable, stable variety. So it was just some variation in those natural genetics that happens in nature, you know, mutations, so to speak, that led to that characteristic. And then it was, a plant breeder that captured that and made it repeatable over time and developed the Nativar. So great question.
Yeah, that was a good question. Thank you. Going back to the Black-Eyed Susan screen, Julie asked, I purchased my original Asclepias tuberosa plant at a nursery, and I now have had many plants for at least 5 years. I've never seen a monarch's cocoon. Might this be because they are nativars?
For butterfly weed, so we're talking Asclepias.
Right. Yeah, that was butterfly weed. I apologize.
Yeah, I don't know. I have them in my yard, and I have seen caterpillars on it. They get eaten really quickly too. So they've disappeared off that plant quite readily, where I tend to find more monarch caterpillars on common milkweed that's planted in my yard. So I don't think that, I don't have any science to back this up, but I don't think that any of the breeding that's done to produce that Nativar of butterfly weed would have really taken out the characteristics that monarchs need in that plant. That's a special chemical that the plant puts out that's toxic to other animals, and that's why monarchs have keyed on that and use it. So just given the fact that the monarch relationship to milkweeds is at the genus level, it's not necessarily down to the species, I would say, in my opinion, the Nativar hasn't made a difference to monarchs. So I'm not sure why you're not seeing them on that particular plant. I can definitely say from my own personal observations, I've seen much fewer monarchs on butterfly weed than common milkweed.
All right. Thank you, Ryan. On the spiderwort screen, Elizabeth asked, is native spiderwort all blue?
Like the spiderwort species we were talking about there, I guess I'd have to go back to that slide and look at down to species. Yes, is native to Illinois and is blue. There's other species, and I don't know them well enough to describe them all to you. But for that particular spiderwort in Illinois, yes, it is technically blue.
Okay, great. On that same screen, Karen asked, what results have been conducted on the ability of nativars for greater pollination with global warming?
So for I guess the question maybe is more effective pollination then?
I think so, yeah, greater pollination. Mm-hmm.
So, I think, probably some of the studies we looked at here really kind of equate to that, where it's just, pollinator preference of the plant is what's been looked at. I don't know, with respect to climate change, that question has been posed in research though. I think we can infer some things that, for what we know about changes to the environment, changes to plants that will occur with climate change, but I don't think that exact question from a research standpoint has been addressed.
Okay, great. Mary Jane asks, do you know any research that's been done on echinacea native versus nativar?
I didn't see a direct comparison here, native versus nativar, but I did look at a lot of those studies that, I had some slides I pulled out of this that talked about non-native versus native. And I felt like probably all of us, since we're here, we're asking the question down to the details of native versus nativar. That's maybe maybe we all already assume that native is better than non-native. So yeah, I've seen studies where echinacea was compared in a plant community of native plants versus non-native, but I haven't seen it where there was nativars compared side by side.
Okay, thank you. Judith comments, where are the trees on this final slide located? It's a stunning picture.
Oh, yeah, actually, I usually mean to mention this picture as I pull it up. One of my favorite spots on earth, down in the Cache River area of Southern Illinois, Heron Pond, is a beautiful public spot. I believe it's an IDNR spot. And yeah, this was taken in the fall time. So I'm ready for, after this week of hot weather, I'm ready for fall to hit. Last week was awesome and felt fall-like. So this picture is a tribute to fall for me and getting on to cooler weather. But yeah, that's a naturally occurring cypress swamp in its native range. But again, not native to Central Illinois, but a great urban tree you can plant. So.
Excellent. Lovely area. Ryan, Ann asks, will natives and nativars cross-pollinate and reproduce?
In most cases, yes. Yep. I think there's some exceptions where flower morphology has been changed enough that it's difficult for pollinators to access the flowers. But yeah, it's still the same species. So genetically speaking, it's still close enough that it can cross-pollinate and is typically fertile, across the two types of plants.
All right, excellent. I think that's all of the questions that we have, Ryan. I want to thank you for your presentation this evening and your expertise in natives versus nativars. I am